You know those stories that really grab you and just won't let go? The kind that feel like they should be made up, fiction, but they're actually chillingly real. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into one of the 20th century's absolute biggest head scratchers, the Dyatlov Pass incident. We're talking 9 experienced Soviet hikers. They vanished in the Ural Mountains way back in 1959. And what they found later, well, it only made things stranger.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, people keen on getting to the core of complex stuff, but like efficiently.
Right.
This is exactly what we're aiming for here. We'll navigate the key facts, the main explanations for what happened, really try to sift through all the noise and speculation and focus on what the sources actually tell us.
Right, because we've got this detailed document, dyatlov.pass.pdf, and it seems to lay out pretty much everything. The background, the timeline, the really unsettling discoveries, autopsy details, even stuff about their clothes, and weirdly, radiation.
Yeah, it's all in there. Camp setup, the brutal weather they faced, the first official conclusions, and more recent investigations, too.
Okay. So our mission then is to pull out the most important, maybe the most intriguing bits from this source. Give everyone listening a clear picture of what happened, what the investigators actually found, and the leading theories, but also be upfront about the questions that, still hang in the air.
Exactly. We want clarity, but we also have to acknowledge the enduring mystery of it all.
Okay, so with that, slightly chilling background set. Let's start with the people involved. Who were these hikers and what were they trying to do out there?
Well, the group's leader was a young guy, Igor Dyatlov, just 23, and it was 8 men, 2 women in total, aged between 20 and 38. And it's really key to stress these weren't novices. They were experienced, seasoned skiers, mountaineers. They'd done long, tough ski treks before.
Right, so they knew what they were doing. And this trip wasn't just a weekend jaunt, was it? It sounds pretty serious.
Oh, definitely. They were aiming for Mount Otorten. That's a 300-kilometer ski expedition. It was classified back then as Category 3, basically the highest difficulty level you could get.
Wow.
They set off from a place called Vizhai on January 25th, 1959.
But didn't someone turn back early on? I think the document mentioned that.
Yeah, that's right. Just a couple of days in, January 27th, one member, Yuri Yudin, had to leave. He was ill. The source mentioned sciatica and some heart issues. So that left 9 hikers to carry on.
And they were keeping records, diaries, and photos?
Yes, exactly. They were documenting the journey as they went, which, gives us some insight, at least into the early parts.
Okay, let's jump forward to February 1st. This is when they set up their last camp. It was on the slope of Kolotsakal, which has that unsettling name, Dead Mountain, in the local Mansi language. And the document points out it was kind of a weird spot to camp, on an open slope.
Yeah, that's one of the first sort of question marks. Why there? The source suggests the weather might have been a big factor. Snowstorms, really bad visibility. Maybe they just misjudged where they were or couldn't reach a more sheltered spot, like down in the trees before dark. Experienced hikers usually would seek shelter.
Okay, so that decision itself is a bit puzzling. And then, nothing. They were supposed to be back by mid-February.
Right. When they didn't show up, didn't send a signal, that's when the search started.
And what was the first big thing the search party found?
Well, on February 26th, they found the tent, abandoned, on that slope.
Mm-hmm.
And the state it was in was, well, deeply disturbing. It was partly collapsed, snowed over. But crucially, all their stuff was still inside. Food, warm clothes, their boots, everything.
Wait, boots. They left their boots behind, but where did they go?
That's the question, isn't it? The core of the whole thing. Because the tent wasn't just abandoned, it had been cut open, slashed from the inside.
Split the inside, so they cut their way out.
Seems like it. Suggests something sudden happened, something that made them panic and flee. And then they found footprints, leading away from the tent, downhill, towards a tree line, about a kilometer and a half away.
Yeah.
Near a big cedar tree, they found signs of a small fire someone had tried to build. But the really disturbing part, some of those footprints, they were just in socks, or even barefoot.
Barefoot? In the Urals, in February. That's unimaginable.
Exactly. Sub-zero temperatures. It makes no sense.
Okay, so finding the tent like that was just the beginning. Things got much worse, right? Let's talk about finding the bodies.
Yeah, it's grim. The bodies were found in stages between late February and May as the snow started to melt. The first 2, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were found down by that cedar tree, the one near the fire.
And how were they found?
Like the footprints suggested. Incredibly underdressed, just underwear. Barefoot or maybe socks. And there were other strange details. Doroshenko had burns on his foot and some of his hair was singed. Krovanichenko was particularly unsettling.
Hmm?
Was missing a piece of flesh from his hand.
Oh, God. Okay. That's deeply weird already. What about the others?
Well, the next three were found scattered between the cedar tree and the tent, sort of heading back up the slope almost. That was Dyatlov himself, Zina Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Dyatlov was found clutching a small birch branch. He and Kolmogorova mostly had signs of, frostbite, minor scrapes. But Slobodin, he had a fractured skull. About a 5-centimeter crack, the document says.
A fractured skull. But you said minor injuries for the others.
Well, yes, relatively. But the thing about Slobodin's fracture is apparently there was no external bleeding with it. Suggests maybe an internal injury or something happened close to the time of death.
Okay, so these first 5, it seems like maybe hypothermia was the main killer, but the circumstances are just bizarre. Leaving the tent, the state of undress, the skull fracture, but then there was that other group, found much later, right, down in a ravine.
Yes. This is where things take an even stranger turn, really, where the autopsy findings become, well, baffling. These are the aha moments the source mentions, the ones that deepen the mystery. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were found way down in a ravine, maybe 75 meters or so from that cedar tree, but they were buried deep, under 4 to 6 meters of snow.
4 to 6 meters, wow. And the condition they were in, the document described it as shocking.
It really was. Dubinina.
Yeah.
She was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. She also had multiple fractured ribs, massive internal bleeding in her chest, just devastating injuries.
Oh my God, missing her tongue and eyes.
Yeah. And Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes and had fractured ribs, too. Thibault-Brignol had a really severe skull fracture. Crushed, essentially.
What about the 4th one, Kolovatov?
Interestingly, he didn't have those kinds of major traumatic injuries, just signs of hypothermia, and he was found sort of embracing Dubinina.
So the autopsies, what did they actually conclude? 6 died of hypothermia, you said.
Right. 6 were listed as dying primarily from hypothermia and frostbite, with those other relatively minor injuries noted. But the 3 in the ravine, Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibault-Brignol, their injuries were described as, well, comparable to the force of a major car crash.
A car crash? But how? And the document says no external wounds.
Exactly. That's the huge puzzle. Immense internal trauma crushed bones, but nothing obvious on the outside. No cuts, no major bruises associated with the breaks.
How is that even possible?
It's incredibly hard to explain. As for Dubinina's missing soft tissues, the tongue, eyes, lips, the document suggests the most likely explanation is actually natural decomposition, given that she was found partly submerged in running water in the ravine, plus potential scavenging by small animals over the months they were missing.
Okay, that part might be explainable, if grimly so. But the internal injuries? Wow. And there were other odd details too, right? Beyond the injuries.
Yes. We mentioned the state of undress for those found near the tree. The document brings up paradoxical undressing, something that can happen in severe hypothermia. People feel hot, irrationally tear off clothes. Maybe that explains it for some.
Maybe. It still feels extreme.
Yeah.
What else? Wasn't there something about radiation?
Ah, yes. That's another detail that always sparks speculation. Low levels of beta radiation were found on some items of clothing belonging to Dubinina and Zolotaryov.
Radiation? Where would that come from?
Well, that's the thing. The source is unclear, according to the document. Could it be residue from something mundane, like thorium in lantern mantles they might have carried, or some kind of environmental contamination? Nobody knows for sure. Importantly, though, it wasn't found on other items tested, just specific pieces. So it was weird, unexplained.
Definitely adds to the whole eerie picture. Okay, so back to the environment. You said the campsite choice was odd. What about the conditions themselves?
Oh, absolutely brutal. Records show temperatures were plummeting. -25, -30 degrees Celsius, maybe even colder with wind chill. And strong winds reported around February 1st and 2nd, which is believed to be when it all happened. And it was just incredibly remote. No settlements anywhere nearby.
Any chance of military activity? Secret tests? Cold War stuff?
That's always been a persistent theory, fueled partly by the radiation finding, maybe. But the document states there's no official record of military exercises in that specific area at that time. And crucially, no debris found. That said, speculation persists, given the era.
What about other people? An attack? You mentioned the Mansi people earlier.
The investigators looked into that very thoroughly. The local Mansi hunters were questioned, but ultimately they were cleared. No motives, no evidence placing them there, and crucially, no signs of any other people being involved. No extra footprints, nothing stolen cameras, money, all left in the tent. No signs of a struggle at the tent either.
Right. So if it wasn't other people, what did the officials say happened back in 1959?
Well, their conclusion was vague, frankly. In May 1959, they closed the case. The official verdict was that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force.
A compelling natural force? What does that even mean?
Exactly. They didn't specify what force. And then they classified the case files, locked them away until the 1970s, which of course only fueled more speculation and conspiracy theories over the decades.
Understandably. So fast forward, more recently there was a new investigation.
Yes, driven by all that public interest that just never went away. Between 2019 and 2021, Russian authorities reopened the case. And this time, they had access to modern tech, computer modeling, things like that.
And what did this new investigation conclude? Did they solve it?
Their most likely conclusion, based on all the modern analysis, points towards an avalanche. Specifically, a small delayed slab avalanche.
An avalanche. Okay, that sounds plausible. Mountainous area, snow. How does that theory explain things?
Well, the idea is this. The hikers cut into the snow slope, which was maybe 15, 20 degrees. Not super steep, but steep enough to pitch their tent. This, or maybe just snow accumulating from the wind, could have destabilized a slab of snow above them. Later that night, maybe hours later, this slab releases. Not necessarily huge, but enough to partially bury the tent.
Ah, hence cutting their way out in a panic.
Exactly. Suddenly buried, maybe injured slightly, disoriented, terrified. They slash their way out and flee downhill. They don't stop for boots or proper clothes because of the immediate perceived danger right there at the tent.
And then hypothermia takes over for most of them.
That's the idea. They get separated in the dark and the storm, the cold gets them. As for the ravine group with the severe injuries, the avalanche theory suggests they could have been swept into the ravine by the snow itself or fallen in while trying to shelter, and the weight of the snow falling on top of them caused those crushing injuries. They actually ran simulations, apparently, showing how katabatic winds and snow loading could trigger such a delayed slide on that kind of slope.
Okay, that does seem to tie up quite a few loose ends. But the document mentions criticisms of this avalanche theory, too.
It does. It's not universally accepted, even now. One main criticism. The original 1959 investigators reported finding no classic signs of an avalanche, like debris fields. Also, that slope, while maybe steep enough, is considered by some experts to be not typically prone to dangerous avalanches.
And what about the footprints?
That's maybe the biggest sticking point for critics. The footprints leading away from the tent were apparently still visible weeks later when the search teams were working. If there had been a significant avalanche that swept people away, you'd expect those tracks to be obliterated, right? Not preserved.
Yeah, that doesn't quite add up. So even the modern avalanche theory has holes, which keeps the door open for other ideas, I guess, even if they sound a bit out there.
Well, yeah. The document briefly mentions a few others. Infrasound, like low-frequency sound from wind patterns causing panic. Possible in theory, but zero direct evidence here. Katabatic winds, those sudden, fierce downhill winds, could explain fleeing the tent, maybe, but not really the ravine injuries.
Military tests. Still pops up.
Still pops up.
Oh.
Persistent speculation, but again, the source says no official records, no debris found. It remains speculation. And then you get into, Yeti theories, UFOs, paranormal stuff, which the document notes are pretty much dismissed by serious investigators for having absolutely no credible evidence.
Right. So it really comes down to this, doesn't it? We have the official vague conclusion from '59, the more recent scientifically plausible avalanche theory. But still, these nagging questions remain.
Exactly. Key questions that maybe you listening are asking right now. Why flee without shoes and coats? What caused those horrific internal injuries with no external signs? Why camp there? And what's the deal with the radiation?
It seems like even with the avalanche theory being the most likely contender based on current science, Dyatlov Pass is still a puzzle, a really tragic puzzle with missing pieces.
It really is. It highlights how maybe a combination of things. Extreme weather, maybe a human error in choosing the campsite, and then a sudden, terrifying natural event could create this perfect storm of tragedy in such an isolated, unforgiving place.
So maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is this. As you think about all the facts, the theories, consider the sheer psychology of it. Imagine being in that situation. Total isolation, extreme cold, then something sudden, terrifying happens in the dark. Maybe it was an avalanche burying the tent. How much could pure fear, panic, and disorientation have driven their actions in those desperate last hours, even if a natural event started at all? Well, it's genuinely chilling to think about.